This is October prayer. Change me, O God, into a tree in autumn, and let my dying be a blaze of glory. Drape me in a crimson leafy gown and deck my soul in dancing flakes of gold. And then, when death comes, and with his hands strips off my rustling garment, let me stand before him proud and naked, unashamed, uncaring, all the strength in me revealed against the sky. O God, make me an autumn tree if I must die. I love that poem, that prayer really, by Harlem Renaissance poet, author Esther Popel. I love how it captures the beauty and dignity of life, even as it acknowledges and embraces death. Over the years, I've read this poem at so many memorial services that to read it this morning brings back a flood of memories. So many faces of those I've loved and lost. This poem helps me remember them in all their strength, grace, and dignity. Among the people this poem reminds me of is an elderly woman who died early in my ministry at All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. I'll never forget visiting her one morning not long before her death. She told me that in recent months and years, many of her friends had died before her, and that most of them were Christians who, as they approached their death, took some comfort from the Christian promise that after death they would experience a reunion with their departed loved ones and with God in heaven. This woman didn't happen to share her friends' belief in an afterlife. And she wondered aloud what consolation or wisdom our Unitarian Universalist tradition offers those facing death. She asked me, Rob, what does it mean to die a Unitarian Universalist? We had a long conversation about it that day, and when I left her, I realized that I, as a Unitarian Universalist minister, owed not only her, but all those I serve with an answer to that very question. What does it mean to die a Unitarian Universalist? And so that day I made a promise that every year, right around All Souls Day, I would share with my congregation some small portion of the wisdom and consolation that our faith offers us as we wrestle with the meaning of our mortality. And so in the time we have remaining this morning, that's what I hope to share with all of you. Now, as you might imagine, there is no single Unitarian teaching on this subject. There's no official UU catechism about living and dying. But there is a stream of wisdom that flows down to us from our religious ancestors, and that I thought I could frame this morning by sharing with you two very brief stories that are told about the death of one of our most famous Unitarian ancestors, Henry David Thoreau. So journey with me, if you will, to the year 1862 and to the Thoreau family home, not too far from here in Concord, Mass, where Henry David, at age 44, lay dying of tuberculosis. In his final days, Thoreau was cared for by his mother, Cynthia, and Sister Sophia, and received visits from a host of extended family and friends. And one story goes that as Thoreau lay dying, one of his aunts, an aunt from a more orthodox religious persuasion, came to his bedside and prayed for his conversion. Hopeful that the prospect of death had finally put the fear of God in her religiously unorthodox nephew, the aunt asked Thoreau, "Henry David, have you finally made your peace with God?" To which Thoreau responded, "I wasn't aware that we'd quarreled." That's the first story. More on that one later. But now to the second story about Thoreau's death that's been passed down to us. The story goes that a close friend visited Thoreau on the last day of his life, just moments before his death. And taking Thoreau's hand in his own, he drew near and whispered to his friend, "Henry David, have you seen it? Have you seen the light from the other shore?" To which Thoreau is said to have replied with his dying breath, "One world at a time, friend. One world at a time." Now, I have no idea whether either of these stories actually happened. But I know that they are true. True to Thoreau's character, true to his gift for the apt and often playful one-liner, and more importantly, true to the wisdom of the faith that we share with him. So let's unpack those two stories for a little while, beginning with the second. The one where Thoreau's friend asks him if he's glimpsed the other shore, and he replies, "One world at a time." I love that story. For Thoreau at the brink of death to say, "One world at a time," is to express a deep appreciation for the worth, value, and goodness of this life, this world. The one we're living in right now. The only one we know of for sure. While some faiths eagerly anticipate paradise in the by and by, ours encourages us to discover paradise and to create it even in the here and now. This perspective encourages us to live fully and in the present, one world at a time, one moment at a time, to notice the beauty of the earth, the beauty of life, to savor it, to protect and preserve it, to not wait around for justice to prevail in heaven, but to create a more just and compassionate world here on earth. When we live our lives fully present to one another and the earth, then when it comes time for us to die, we don't have so many regrets. We don't look back and say, "Gosh, I wish I'd done this or that," or "I wish I'd reconciled with my father or with my son." Thoreau doesn't sound like a man who's leaving the world with a lot of regrets, does he? Or that he's counting on what comes next to compensate for any lack in this world. Up until the very end, Thoreau is savoring this life one world at a time. A while back, a colleague of mine and I were interviewed on public radio about different religions' approaches to life and death. And at one point in the interview, the host turned to my colleague and asked him point blank, "Do Unitarians believe in life after death?" Now, I was grateful she asked him and not me that question on live talk radio. Do Unitarians believe in life after death? My colleague thought about it for a moment and responded, we believe in life after birth. And he wasn't just being clever. He was saying, this life is the one we believe in. Right? The one we can be sure of. The one we put our faith and trust and hope in. My colleague went on to explain that we don't necessarily deny that there's something that follows death. It's just that our foremost spiritual concern is not so much what happens when I die, but what happens when I stop living, right? When I'm alive, but I've stopped living. Stop being fully present to life. That, more than death, is the great spiritual danger we face. Preaching to his congregation just across the river in Back Bay, Emerson often touched on this same issue. He'd often ask his congregants from the pulpit, are you living or are you merely growing old? The difference between those two qualities of living makes a world of difference, doesn't it? Are you living or are you merely growing old? Friends, some religions focus their efforts on preparing people's souls for the afterlife. As Unitarian Universalists, our goal is perhaps more modest and more audacious. We're really trying to equip souls for this life, life after birth, so that we can live joyful and meaningful and loving lives in this world, and so that when we come to die, we feel as though we have lived a life worthy of the precious gift that we've been given. You know, when it comes down to it, this is why I'm a Unitarian Universalist. Because at some point I decided that I don't want to hold out for some future paradise. That I would cast my lot with this life, with this world, and with all of you. One world at a time. Now, before I close, I want to come back to that first deathbed story that I told about Thoreau. The one where his Orthodox aunt frets over the fate of his immortal soul, asking him, Henry David, have you finally made your peace with God? Now, first of all, I don't know a Unitarian who doesn't have at least one Orthodox relative who harbors such fears for us, right? And who is fervently praying for our conversion. I know I've got some relatives who are doing that for me, and I'm about to see them at Thanksgiving. To his aunt's well-meaning and anxious question, have you made your peace with God? You'll remember that Thoreau replies, I wasn't aware that we'd quarreled. Thoreau's words here speak to a core premise and promise of our Unitarian Universalist faith, which is that our relationship with God, however we understand God, or our relationship with the universe, is not fundamentally an antagonistic one, right? That in a fundamental way, we are at home in this universe, in this world, that we belong. And that if there is a God, that we are right with God, right? Reconciled and at one with God. It's the faith that whether in this life or the next, And no matter our struggles and our sufferings, our trials and tribulations, our sins and our failings, that ultimately we are held in the embrace of love. This is a belief that our religious ancestors fought passionately to defend. A theological debate that played out in the history of this very congregation and in the university across the street. Our Unitarian ancestors rebelled against a New England Puritanism that often portrayed human beings as, quote, to quote Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God. A tradition that portrayed God as an angry father who must be appeased, or a feudal lord to whom we owe some kind of debt. Our ancestors said, wait, this isn't the God we know and love, right? They pointed to the book of Genesis, where it says that God lovingly created the world and created human beings in God's own image, and when God was done with it all, pronounced it all good, right? This vision of human beings, God, and the world reconciled and at one with each other is a bedrock principle of our faith. Doesn't mean we don't stray and struggle, but in the end, we are all held in love's embrace, in our living and in our dying. So taken together, these two stories suggest that Thoreau died at peace, don't they? At peace with himself and with the life he lived, at peace with the universe and with the God of his understanding. That peace was in part a gift of his Unitarian faith, and its invitation to be fully present to this life and this world. All in all, you get the impression that though he died young, he died grateful. And that another way to sum up Thoreau's final words might be simply, thank you. Right? When our days are over, may our hearts be filled with gratitude, and may thank you be the final prayer on our lips. Amen.